A first-class flight is supposed to be a luxurious and relaxing experience. But for legendary actor Dwayne Johnson, it turned into an unforgettable incident. When a racist flight attendant attacked the famous star mid-flight, chaos quickly broke out. However, what happened next shocked everyone on board. It was a dramatic and unexpected story that no one saw coming. The roar of the engines echoed throughout the luxurious first-class cabin. Passengers reclined in plush seats, sipped champagne, and enjoyed carefully prepared meals. Among them was Dwayne Johnson, a world-famous actor and cultural icon, dressed in a shiny black tracksuit with yellow accents, his relaxed demeanor exuding confidence. As he adjusted his sunglasses and settled into his plush leather seat, the flight attendants quickly moved to attend to the special guests. However, one in particular, Lisa, couldn't hide her discomfort at seeing Dwayne in first class. Lisa had worked for the airline for more than a decade, proudly maintaining what she called first-class etiquette standards for casual wear. And Dwayne's presence seemed out of place amidst the tailored suits and designer dresses. Though she kept her face neutral, her clenched jaw and narrowed eyes betrayed her thoughts. As she walked down the aisle delivering drinks, she found herself lingering near Dwayne's seat, her gaze sharp and judgmental. Dwayne, ever perceptive, noticed the subtle hostility but chose to brush it off. He greeted her with a polite smile and a casual "thank you, ma'am," when she handed him a glass of water. Lisa nodded curtly, barely meeting his eyes. To her, his courteous demeanor only heightened her discomfort. She couldn't reconcile the image of the laid-back actor with her preconceived notions of who deserved to occupy the most coveted seats on the plane. As the flight progressed, Lisa's discomfort simmered each time she passed by Dwayne's seat, her irritation fueled by her biases and the polite friendliness he extended to those around him. By the end of the chapter, she made her first passive-aggressive comment, leaning slightly over to adjust his tray. "First class isn't what it used to be," she muttered, her voice low but clear enough for him to hear. Dwayne paused, his smile fading momentarily, but he said nothing. The tension hung in the air, unnoticed by most but palpable to those attuned to the subtle cracks in civility. Lisa's words lingered in Dwayne's mind as he reclined in his seat, the faint hum of the engines a background to his thoughts. He had faced such prejudice before, and while it wasn't new, it was never easy. Around him, passengers engaged in light chatter, completely unaware of the quiet storm brewing between him and the flight attendant. Yet Dwayne wasn't one to let negativity ruin his day. He adjusted his shades and picked up a magazine, his demeanor as cool and composed as ever. As Lisa continued her rounds, her frustration grew with every step. She exchanged pleasantries with other passengers, her demeanor warm and professional. However, whenever her path led her back to Dwayne, her polite mask slipped just enough to reveal the disdain beneath. Her colleagues began to notice. Emma, a junior flight attendant, observed Lisa's behavior with unease. She whispered to another crew member, "Do you think she has a problem with him? She's not acting like herself." The tension became more apparent during meal service. When Dwayne requested a refill of his drink, Lisa hesitated before responding. "I'll see if we have any left," she said curtly, despite the fact that other passengers were being served promptly. Moments later, Emma approached his seat with the refill, a bright smile on her face. "Here you go, Mr. Johnson. Let me know if you need anything else," she said cheerfully, a subtle attempt to ease the awkwardness caused by Lisa's cold demeanor. The chapter closed with Lisa's rising annoyance reaching its peak after a particularly warm exchange between Dwayne and Emma. Lisa's patience finally snapped, and she leaned over to another passenger, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with venom. "It's shocking what passes for first-class clientele these days," she said, the remark dripping with condescension. Unfortunately for her, the passenger she confided in didn't share her prejudices. Instead, he glanced at Dwayne and shook his head, disapproving of Lisa's attitude. Dwayne, catching the interaction from the corner of his eye, decided it was time to address the situation on his own terms. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. The faint murmur of conversation seemed to take on an edge, a quiet tension that built as Lisa's behavior became harder to ignore. Dwayne Johnson, ever the calm observer, leaned back in his seat and removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were both focused and thoughtful. He had dealt with situations like this many times, and though he preferred to maintain peace, there were moments when silence wasn't an option. Lisa approached his seat again, her expression strained. This time, it wasn't subtle. She slammed his tray down harder than necessary, rattling the glass on it. "Is everything fine now?" she asked, her tone sharp and laced with sarcasm. The suddenness of her action drew the attention of nearby passengers. Dwayne looked up at her, his expression neutral but his voice calm. "Everything's just fine. Thank you for checking," he replied, his tone smooth but unmistakably firm. Her eyes flashed with irritation, and she leaned closer. "You know, some people work their whole lives to afford this kind of luxury," she said, her voice low but audible to those nearby. "Must be nice to just slide in without earning it." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged shocked glances, and Emma, the junior flight attendant, froze mid-step, her tray trembling in her hands. Dwayne stood, his towering presence commanding attention. He adjusted his jacket and turned to face Lisa fully. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady but resonating with authority. "Respect is free. It doesn't cost a thing to give it, but it sure says a lot about who you are when you don't." The cabin fell silent, every eye fixed on the confrontation. Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, an older passenger interjected, his voice booming. "That's enough. Young lady, we're here to enjoy a peaceful flight, not endure your personal grievances." The chapter ended with Lisa retreating to the galley, her face flushed with embarrassment. Dwayne, embodying composure, sat back down, his dignity intact. Passengers whispered among themselves, some apologizing to him on behalf of the crew. Meanwhile, Emma approached him with a soft smile, her voice tinged with regret. "I'm so sorry for what just happened. Sir, please know that not all of us feel that way." Dwayne nodded, offering a small smile. "It's all good. Just handle it right." But as he leaned back into his seat, his thoughts were far from over. The first-class cabin buzzed with murmurs, passengers exchanging disbelieving glances after the confrontation. Lisa remained out of sight, retreating to the galley in an attempt to regain her composure. Her hands shook as she gripped the counter, replaying the scene over and over in her mind. Her pride was bruised, but her sense of entitlement kept her anger simmering. Meanwhile, Emma and another senior flight attendant, James, discussed the situation in hushed tones. "We need to address this with the captain," Emma insisted, her voice firm but tinged with concern. "This behavior isn't just unprofessional, it's unacceptable." James sighed, nodding reluctantly. "I'll inform him," he replied, "but I want to make sure Mr. Johnson is comfortable first. This isn't how we treat our guests, no matter who they are." Back in his seat, Dwayne maintained his signature calm demeanor, but his mind was anything but calm. He had faced countless moments of prejudice in his life, and while he'd learned to pick his battles, something about this incident lingered. It wasn't just about him. It was about the broader message such behavior sent. "If this is how she acts with me," he thought, "what's she like with someone who doesn't have a platform to speak up?" As James approached, he offered a respectful nod. "Mr. Johnson, on behalf of our crew, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened earlier. Please know we're taking this very seriously." Dwayne studied him for a moment before responding. "I appreciate that, but this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to deal with this kind of treatment. Handle it right, and we're good." The chapter closed with the captain addressing the passengers over the intercom, offering a general apology for any inconvenience during the flight. Meanwhile, Lisa sat in the crew quarters, visibly shaken, as James informed her that her behavior would be documented and reported. "This isn't over," he warned, his tone firm but measured. Outside, the first-class cabin began to settle again, but the air remained charged with the weight of what had transpired. Dwayne leaned back in his seat, his gaze out the window reflecting on the path he'd taken to rise above moments like these. The flight moved forward, but the tension in the first-class cabin lingered. Passengers whispered among themselves, many stealing glances at DWAYNE, their admiration for his calm demeanor evident. For Lisa, however, the consequences of her actions were just beginning to unfold. Back in the galley, she attempted to compose herself, but her colleagues' stares were sharp, their judgment clear. Emma, though typically reserved, couldn't hold back any longer. "You've crossed a line." "Lisa," Emma said, her voice low but firm, "you think your attitude reflects professionalism? Because all I see is someone letting their prejudice ruin what should have been a seamless flight." Lisa scoffed, brushing past her. "You don't understand," she snapped. "People like him." But Emma cut her off, her voice rising slightly. "People like him? He's done nothing but treat everyone with respect. Maybe you should try the same." Meanwhile, DWAYNE remained in his seat, trying to focus on his book, but the incident replayed in his mind. He thought about the countless individuals who faced similar treatment but lacked the means to defend themselves. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the subtle discomfort of other passengers, many of whom had chosen to stay silent. It wasn't unusual, but it was disheartening. Determined to make a statement, DWAYNE signaled for Emma. When she approached, her expression was apologetic, but before she could speak, he raised a hand gently. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he began, his voice calm, "but I do think it's important to address what happened earlier. It's not about me. This kind of behavior is bigger than just one flight." Emma nodded, her respect for him growing. "I agree," she said, "and I promise you, we're not letting this slide." As the chapter concluded, Lisa overheard their conversation, her anger flaring once again. But for the first time, doubt crept in, the realization that she was losing support among her peers. In the cabin, DWAYNE remained focused, knowing this was just the beginning of a broader conversation about respect and accountability. The path forward was uncertain, but he was ready to take it one step at a time. The murmur of the engines served as a constant backdrop as the flight pressed onward. DWAYNE, sitting calmly yet thoughtfully, weighed the impact of his next steps. He had spent years championing equality and respect, using his platform to shed light on injustice. Now, faced with this blatant act of prejudice, he felt compelled to turn the moment into something meaningful. But first, he needed clarity on how the airline would handle the situation. In the galley, Lisa's demeanor had shifted, though her exterior remained defiant. The whispers and sideways glances from her colleagues had begun to chip away at her confidence. Emma and James, resolute in their professionalism, had already informed the captain of her actions, ensuring that a formal report would be made. Still, Lisa clung to her pride, convinced she was being unfairly targeted. Emma approached DWAYNE's seat cautiously, holding a tray with a fresh drink. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her tone sincere, "I wanted to let you know that we've escalated the matter to the captain. What happened earlier does not reflect our values, and we deeply regret your experience." DWAYNE met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "I appreciate that," he said, "but what happens after the flight? That's what matters." This moment of interaction didn't go unnoticed. Passengers nearby listened intently, their expressions shifting from mere curiosity to quiet support. One woman seated a few rows behind leaned forward. "I just want to say," she began hesitantly, "that your patience is admirable. Not everyone would have handled it like you did." DWAYNE offered her a nod of acknowledgement but kept his focus on Emma as the conversation unfolded. Lisa stood nearby, half hidden in the galley, listening with clenched fists. She felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Was it guilt or fear of the repercussions that awaited her? Regardless, she was unprepared for the new direction the situation had taken. DWAYNE wasn't just addressing the insult. He was turning it into an opportunity for dialogue and change. The chapter closed with DWAYNE looking out the window, his mind set on how this incident could be leveraged to spark a broader conversation about respect and accountability beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. As the flight continued, the cabin's atmosphere remained tense, but it was no longer just about Lisa's actions. Passengers began to openly discuss what had occurred, their whispers growing louder. Some commended DWAYNE's calm demeanor, while others expressed shock at Lisa's unprofessional behavior. The situation had transformed into a collective reckoning. with each person reflecting on what they had witnessed and their own silence. In the galley, Lisa's confidence had all but crumbled. Emma and James's pointed glances and whispered conversations made it clear she was losing their support. Desperation began to set in, and she attempted to justify her behavior to James. "He's just another entitled celebrity," she hissed, her voice trembling. "They always think they're above the rules." James's expression darkened as he replied firmly, "The only one breaking the rules here is you. Lisa, this isn't about him. It's about your inability to treat people with basic decency." Back in the cabin, DWAYNE remained the picture of composure, but the weight of the situation pressed on him. He noticed the subtle shift among the passengers. More of them were meeting his gaze with looks of quiet solidarity. Encouraged by this, he decided it was time to address the issue more openly. Rising from his seat, he adjusted his jacket and walked toward the galley. All eyes followed him, a mix of curiosity and anticipation filling the air. When DWAYNE reached the galley, Lisa stiffened, her face pale. Emma and James stepped aside, their expressions supportive yet cautious. DWAYNE's voice was calm but firm as he addressed Lisa directly. "Look," he began, "I don't know what's going on with you, but what you said and how you acted wasn't just disrespectful. It was harmful. People deserve respect, no matter where they're from or what they look like. That's the bottom line." Lisa's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Emma interjected. "He's right. Lisa, this isn't about rules or entitlement. It's about how you chose to treat someone who didn't deserve it." The confrontation left Lisa speechless, and as she turned away, the passengers in the cabin began to clap softly, their support for DWAYNE unmistakable. The chapter closed with DWAYNE returning to his seat, the faint applause fading into the hum of the engines. He felt a small sense of accomplishment, but knew the real work was just beginning. The incident had exposed a deeper issue, and he was determined to see it addressed, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The soft applause had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that filled the cabin. Lisa retreated further into the galley, her face a mixture of fury and shame. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, their quiet disapproval more cutting than any words they could have said. Yet even as the passengers sided with DWAYNE, Lisa refused to fully confront her actions, her mind spinning with justifications and excuses. DWAYNE sat back in his seat, his calm exterior masking an internal storm. He knew the confrontation had been necessary, but it weighed on him nonetheless. He had spent years advocating for equality and respect, yet here he was again, facing the same prejudice. The applause and support from the passengers were encouraging, but they also felt hollow. Would their empathy last beyond this flight? Would real change come from this? As the plane flew steadily through the sky, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to apologize for any disruptions during the flight. Please be assured that all matters are being handled appropriately." The generic tone of the announcement felt like a dismissal, as though the incident was merely an inconvenience rather than a deeper issue. DWAYNE shook his head, a wave of frustration washing over him. To make matters worse, Lisa, emboldened by the captain's neutral announcement, emerged briefly from the galley. Though she avoided DWAYNE's section, her defiant posture made it clear she wasn't ready to take accountability. The sight of her stoked whispers among the passengers, some visibly agitated by her presence. Emma, watching from a distance, felt her patience wearing thin. She approached Lisa in the galley, her voice firm and resolute. "You need to stay back here and reflect on what you've done. The damage you've caused isn't something you can brush off." As the chapter closed, DWAYNE stared out the window, his reflection mirrored in the glass. For the first time during the flight, doubt crept into his mind. Had he truly made a difference? Or would this moment be forgotten as soon as the plane landed? The faint hum of the engines seemed to echo his unease, a reminder that the journey toward change was far from over. As the flight neared its final hours, the mood in the first-class cabin remained heavy. While some passengers had returned to their routines, the underlying tension was undeniable. For DWAYNE, the silence following the captain's vague apology felt like a missed opportunity, a failure to address a moment that could have sparked meaningful dialogue. Still, he wasn't ready to let the incident be swept under the rug. In the galley, Lisa sat alone, her back to the crew as she silently replayed the events in her mind. Her pride still clung to the belief that she had done nothing wrong. But cracks began to form in her defenses. Emma's words earlier had hit a nerve, and the visible support for DWAYNE among the passengers was something she couldn't ignore. For the first time, Lisa felt the weight of her isolation. Sensing the need for a larger statement, DWAYNE stood from his seat once more. This time, he wasn't headed for the galley. Instead, he turned to address the passengers directly. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable strength. "I want to thank everyone here for showing support earlier," he began, his gaze sweeping across the cabin. "But this isn't just about me. What happened here is part of something bigger. Every one of us has a role to play in making sure respect isn't optional, it's a given." His words struck a chord, and the passengers listened intently. Some nodded in agreement while others, inspired by his courage, clapped quietly. Emma watched from the galley, her admiration for DWAYNE growing as he used the moment to elevate the conversation beyond himself. Even James, the senior attendant, seemed moved, his expression one of quiet reflection. The turning point came when Emma, emboldened by DWAYNE's leadership, approached the captain in the cockpit. "This isn't something we can gloss over with a generic apology," she told him, her voice steady but firm. "We need to make this right for Mr. Johnson and for everyone who's ever experienced this kind of treatment." The captain, initially hesitant, finally agreed. A formal acknowledgement would be made, and Lisa's actions would face immediate review upon landing. As the chapter concluded, DWAYNE returned to his seat, the cabin filled with renewed energy. The passengers, once silent observers, had become active participants in a shared commitment to accountability and respect. DWAYNE leaned back, his gaze once again drifting to the window. This time, however, his reflection looked stronger, more determined. The battle wasn't over, but the tides were beginning to turn. As the flight approached its descent, the cabin crew prepared for the landing, but the tension from the earlier confrontation still simmered beneath the surface. Lisa lingered in the galley, avoiding eye contact with passengers and crew. Her usual air of authority had all but vanished, replaced by a quiet unease. Meanwhile, DWAYNE remained calm, but his focus sharpened as he anticipated what awaited on the ground. Emma, now acting as the voice of reason among the crew, approached DWAYNE's seat. "Mr. Johnson," she said softly, "the captain will be making a more formal statement before we land. I want to assure you that this isn't being brushed under the rug. Lisa's actions will be reported, and steps will be taken to ensure this doesn't happen again." DWAYNE nodded, appreciating her sincerity. "Thank you for standing up," he replied. "It's not easy to speak out, especially when you're part of the same team, but that's what makes it matter even more." Emma smiled faintly, her resolve strengthening. She knew that handling the situation correctly wasn't just about following protocol. It was about setting a standard for the future. The passengers, too, seemed to prepare themselves for a collective moment of reckoning. A few whispered among themselves about how they might support DWAYNE once the plane landed. Others, previously silent, now felt emboldened by his earlier speech. "It's not just about this flight," one passenger remarked to another. "It's about how people like him get treated every day. This feels bigger than us." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain deliberated over his next step. Encouraged by Emma and James, he finally decided to address the incident directly, a choice he knew would have implications beyond the immediate flight. "Attention, ladies and gentlemen." His voice came over the intercom, clear and steady. "Before we begin our descent, I want to acknowledge the events that occurred earlier on this flight. As an airline, we hold ourselves to the highest standards of respect and professionalism, and I deeply regret that a valued passenger was treated unfairly. Please know that this matter will be taken seriously, and steps will be taken to ensure accountability." The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and quiet applause. DWAYNE listened intently, his expression unreadable. While it wasn't a perfect resolution, it was a start, a sign that his efforts were not in vain. As the chapter closed, the city lights came into view through the windows. signaling the flight's impending landing. DWAYNE sat back, mentally preparing for the final steps of this journey, knowing the real confrontation awaited once the plane touched down. The plane touched down smoothly, but the tension in the first-class cabin was anything but settled. Passengers gathered their belongings, exchanging meaningful glances. Knowing that the events of the flight weren't over, DWAYNE Johnson remained seated, calm but resolute, waiting for the next steps. Lisa, in stark contrast, lingered in the galley, her composure fraying under the weight of the captain's announcement and the knowledge that her actions would face scrutiny. As passengers began to disembark, Emma approached DWAYNE. "Security and airline officials are waiting at the gate," she said quietly. "You'll have the chance to formally document what happened." DWAYNE nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady. "Let's make sure it's handled the right way." The first-class cabin emptied, leaving DWAYNE, Lisa, and the remaining crew to face the officials waiting beyond the gate. When the cabin door opened, a small group of airline representatives and security personnel stepped inside. The lead official, a composed woman with a professional yet stern demeanor, introduced herself. "Mr. Johnson," she began, "we've been informed of the incident that occurred during this flight. We'd like to hear your account of what happened." DWAYNE stood, his presence commanding but not aggressive. "It's not complicated," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I was treated with blatant disrespect because of preconceived notions. This isn't just about me. It's about how people are judged and treated based on how they look or who they are. That's not acceptable, and it shouldn't be tolerated." Lisa, standing nearby, bristled but remained silent. Her earlier bravado had given way to a mixture of fear and regret. When the officials turned to her for her account, she stammered, struggling to justify her actions. I didn't mean to cause any harm," she said, her voice faltering. "I was just doing my job." But her words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming support for DWAYNE and the visible disappointment of her colleagues. The climax came when the lead official addressed Lisa directly. "Your behavior not only violated our company's policies, but also our values. Effective immediately. You are suspended pending further investigation." The declaration was met with silence, broken only by Lisa's quiet gasp. She looked at DWAYNE, perhaps hoping for a reprieve, but his gaze remained steady, unyielding. As the chapter closed, DWAYNE stepped into the terminal, greeted by a small crowd of passengers who had witnessed the events unfold. Many offered words of encouragement, while others simply nodded in silent solidarity. DWAYNE thanked them graciously, knowing that while this battle was over, the fight for respect and equality continued. The terminal was alive with the sounds of bustling travelers and the quiet murmur of conversations. As DWAYNE exited the gate area, the weight of the incident began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. He had turned an ugly moment of prejudice into an opportunity for change, and while the journey wasn't complete, it was a step forward. The passengers who had supported him exchanged parting words, their admiration evident. Emma, standing nearby, approached one last time. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice tinged with both regret and gratitude. "I'm sorry this happened, but I'm grateful for how you handled it. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for something bigger." DWAYNE smiled warmly, his trademark calm intact. "It's all love," he replied. "You can't change the world overnight, but every moment counts. Thanks for being part of the solution." Meanwhile, Lisa was escorted out of the terminal by airline officials, her face pale and her shoulders slumped. The reality of her actions had finally sunk in. For the first time, she felt the weight of her choices, not just the consequences for her career, but the deeper realization of the harm she had caused. The journey ahead for her was unclear, but the moment had planted a seed of reflection that she could no longer ignore. As DWAYNE exited into the cool night air, a group of reporters waited outside the terminal. News of the incident had spread, and cameras flashed as he walked toward a waiting car. One reporter called out, "Mr. Johnson, do you have any comment on what happened during the flight?" DWAYNE paused, turning to face them. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "Respect is a two-way street. No matter where you come from, what you look like, or who you are. Everybody deserves it. That's the message. The car door closed behind him, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving the airport behind. DWAYNE leaned back in the seat, his reflection visible in the dark window. He thought about the long road ahead. How many more moments like this would arise, and how much work was left to be done. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing he had stood up for what mattered. The story closed with a message of resilience and hope. As the plane's passengers returned to their lives, many carried with them a renewed sense of accountability and awareness. For DWAYNE, the incident became another chapter in his journey, a reminder that while progress was slow, every stand taken in the name of respect brought the world one step closer to true equality. Thank you all for watching until now. If you made it here, comment justice and see you next time.